In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Getting back to the news of the week, because there's so much to cover, and I know we've only got half an hour left, so I'm going to try and move through this pretty rapid fire. But, up in Canada, my friend Rick Walker had a really tough week. All of our Canadian viewers, our Canadian friends, all of a sudden, practically overnight, since that incident happened in the Canadian Parliament last Friday. Social media went wild, the media went wild, and all of a sudden they all feel like Canada is being labeled as, the new Nazi Germany. People think of Canada now as a Nazi nation, which I think is, of course, not true. I work with the Canadian people on Maverick News. I talk to them and hear from them every day. I have so many friends up in Canada, and I know for a fact that's not true. The Canadian people are not fascists. Now, there's always been that element in Canada, just as there has been in this country. But when you look to our governments, Caleb, in both Canada and the United States, I would have to say that there's been a strong undercurrent of fascism. And I think in more recent years, certainly since this war began, the masks are coming off. And what we saw in Parliament last week was truly a masks off moment.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. His name is Yaroslav Hunka. And I was going to say he's in the gallery, but I think you beat me to that. But I'm very proud to say that he is from North Bay and from my riding of Nipissing-Temiskaming. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service. Thank you.
Well, he's against Russia, so we should just clap. Because that's what mainstream media has told us, right? He was against Russia, even back in World War II, right? Oh, yeah, let's just clap, right? It's like these people never opened a history book. What side would fighting Russia in World War II put you on? Think about it now, right?
And we are to believe that every single member of the Canadian Parliament is that stupid? I mean, what the hell? Let me just show you. They said, "Thank you for your service. You're a great soldier." This is his unit, guys. This is the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the 1st Galician Division. What you're looking at here is a recruitment poster from 1943, and Yaroslav Hunka actually published a memoir, which I think is still up online. I'm sure they're going to memory hole that pretty soon, but it's him telling his story as a youth, how he adored and looked up to Bandera's OUN, the OUNB, how he looked up to the Waffen-SS and couldn't wait to join. And he did, in fact, join in 1943. That is the year that this poster was seen around his little village there in Ukraine, right? This is a typical poster of that same year of 1943. And of course, they are, apparently he's a national hero in Canada until he wasn't. Something kind of interesting happened this week. And I kind of look at this whole thing, Caleb, as a blessing in disguise because it was a masks off moment. It made a lot of normies out there who haven't been paying attention this whole time really take a good look at Ukraine, at the glorification of their national heroes in that country, who many of them were, in fact, Nazis, straight up Nazis, their long, long history, what Ukrainian nationalism is, and most importantly, how we imported that to the West. And, after the war, the CIA and British intelligence picked these guys out of camps, mostly in Italy, prisoner of war camps. And that is where Yaroslav Hunka was. He writes about it in his memoir, how they surrendered to the British, of course, at the end of the war. And next thing you know, he's at a camp in Italy and they find him potentially useful. And so he and many members of his Waffen unit were eventually brought to Great Britain and then to Canada. And it turns out there's a huge number of them in Canada. Canada ended up taking a lot more of the Ukrainian element and the Ukrainian war criminals than the United States did, and more than Britain did. Basically, it's not so much Canada's fault, is that we ordered them to do it. And what are they going to do? Say no when the United States CIA says, hey, we want you to take these guys? They took them.
I have been seeing stuff like this for years. I'm happy to see other people noticing it for once. I remember when I first moved to New York City, this was before 2014 even. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they're on the subway and they hand out the Watchtower or whatever. And I take it because I've handed out leaflets so many times. Anyone who's handed out a leaflet, I'll take it out of respect, So I took the Watchtower and they had a memoir kind of a piece about one of the leading Jehovah's Witnesses of Argentina. And he was from Ukraine and he'd been in a Mennonite village, but luckily he'd been oppressed by evil Stalin. But luckily the SS and the Nazis came and invaded and he joined the SS and he was in the SS. It was in the SS that someone recruited him to being a Jehovah's Witness. And now he lives in Argentina and he's a leader of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Argentina. And I read that story and I was like laughing my head off. I'm like, am I the only person who can see what this is?
Yeah.
And I've been seeing stuff like that for years. And, I did an interview on Sputnik Radio and they quoted me. I did political work in Cleveland for many years. There's a big Ukrainian American community in Parma and Parma Heights in Cleveland, right? Which is a suburb.
I didn't know that.
There's a lot of Ukrainians there. And I went to college, on the west side of Cleveland with people from that area. And, the argument, it starts with, you're a communist. Oh, well, communists are the most evil people. My family's Ukrainian. We know how evil they are. They're actually worse than Hitler. And the argument proceeds. Well, actually, did you know the Holocaust didn't really happen? Hitler's actually was just trying to protect us from the Russians. He was going to give us independence afterwards. And
they say.
Yeah, and what bothered me wasn't so much that they would say that, because this is an extremist exile community, like the Miami Cubans, like the Shah supporters in Sunset Park who fled. I mean, what do you expect? What bothered me was the response of other people who weren't Ukrainian when I would tell them about this. Like, these people are literally making pro-Hitler statements, and they would all say to me, well, Caleb, their people lived under communism, and communism is just so bad. I mean, there's like this pass. You know what I'm saying? There's this pass.
That's right.
Another thing that happened, which is worth noting, is in 2014, when the Euromaidan coup was happening, there was a very, very, very small communist meeting that happened in Chicago at the United Electrical Workers Hall. And it was tiny. There were like 14 people there. Okay. But the Ukrainian community of Chicago mobilized thousands of people outside to protest. And there were thousands of people outside protesting. And then several people from this Ukrainian community in Chicago went inside the United Electrical Workers Hall, locked themselves in the bathroom, and called 911 and said, the communists have taken me hostage in the building. And so the Chicago Police Department came in with guns drawn to make sure no one was being held there against their will. And that's how nutty like these folks are. And of course, were any of them arrested for making a false alarm? Of course not, and, stuff like that has gone on. In New York City, there is a Ukrainian building on the Lower East Side that's got, all the flags and all the pictures, Stepan Bandera, all of that in there. And that there's just been this past because everyone just assumes, well, communists are just so bad that it's okay to be a Nazi. And it's infuriating. It's infuriating, especially when they call all kinds of people Nazis nowadays who aren't, right? Trump's not a Nazi, right?
The way that Trudeau demonized the trucker convoy last year, literally called them Nazis.
He's going to call them Nazis, and then he's going to honor an actual Nazi. It's like everyone's a Nazi except for the actual Nazis. It's really
there you go. Yes, all that. And, in addition to that standing ovation that went viral that Parliament gave to the Ukrainian Nazi, there's another video that emerged that most people have not seen yet. I want to show you this and tell you about this because I don't know if you've been following it. All this happened in 1 week up in Canada. Things are getting really weird in Canada. Speaking of convoys, there is a mysterious convoy rolling across Canada right now as we speak. Its exact goals or what they're protesting are unknown. Its destination is undisclosed. And, this, I should be clear that this convoy has been denounced by many people who were involved with the original Freedom Convoy of truckers protesting vaccine mandates back in 2022. A lot of those organizers say, this is weird. I want nothing to do with it. I think they're up to some violence, some trouble. And it turns out, the police are taking it very seriously. When word emerged this week that the convoy was headed to Toronto, Toronto police shut down the city center and blocked off all the roads so that the vehicles couldn't get into the city center. There was another guy who was shot by police. I'm trying to think of his name. I can't recall his name right now. I just saw it. Jermaine LeMay, 30-year-old man, was making threats against Trudeau. And he is under arrest. He wasn't killed. He is apparently in stable condition. But, the Canadian government is taking this convoy very, very seriously. Now, the original Freedom Convoy was, demonized by the Trudeau government as a bunch of fascists, a bunch of Nazis. But this particular convoy, this new convoy, they call themselves the Save the Children East-West Convoy. And basically, they're coming from all over Canada to converge ultimately somewhere, but they are keeping all their plans secret. They're only in like private little Facebook groups. There's nothing on Twitter, no press releases, no interviews. It seems strange to me that an activist group who's protesting something doesn't make their goals public, what they hope to achieve, and not seeking publicity is highly unusual. But there's a video that emerged, it's pretty troubling, of convoy participants this week. I think it was just yesterday or the day before. And some of these guys are looking kind of fascist to me. I wanted to play this for you and get your thoughts because you can hear them in this clip. And they're invoking the Holodomor as an apparent call to violence against communists. I'm going to show you this and see what you think of it. This is when the convoy stopped for fuel somewhere, and I guess somebody got it on tape.
them to the masses of those who wish to put you into slavery. I from Ukrainian brothers! To get away from Holodomor! To get away from the communists who drove us into starvation by the millions! Look it up, you fucking Google idiots! Look it up! Holodomor! Look it up! And you have who? You got Miss Freeland out there! You got this fucking Freeland up there holding an ASAP flag! The Nazi flag! Get it on the board! And you stand ready! You stand ready for those people to kill my people! To kill my people! I am done! Done! It stops now!
Okay.
We're able to hear that because there's a lot of wind and a lot of noise, but you could make out he was screaming about the Holodomor and the communists who are going to put us all in slavery, and the communists are the problem, is what he's saying. And you know, the thing that's really bizarre to me, Caleb, and I'm sure to you too, is, you know, they believe that Trudeau is a communist, that Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister and finance minister, that she's a communist, and that the source of all of their troubles in this fucked up government they have, that they're all communists, and they think Joe Biden is a communist. And, you know, they literally believe that the communists are their enemy. I'm trying to show them, and I hope the Canadian Parliament showed them this week, that they are the opposite of communists. The government in Canada is in fact quite fascist, and that is, the communists are not the cause of all your troubles, right? But they've been brainwashed over 75 years through the Cold War and again in the 21st century to believe that Russians and the communists are the source of all of their problems, and so we have to go fight them. I'm troubled when I hear that, Caleb, because I know where it leads. I know that in the 20th century, communists were murdered in greater numbers all over the world than any other political group. The numbers are staggering. I'm not just talking about the Holocaust and World War II. I'm talking about since 1917, all over the world, even people who weren't communists, who were just maybe suspected of being a little communist or a fellow traveler, they could be taken out and shot. And they often were. So this kind of rhetoric troubles me, and I see it tied in, intermeshed with a lot of talk against the Jews and against gay people, trans people, etc. I'm not a wokeist. I'm the furthest thing from that. I'm not a communist either. I'm just a historian who's kind of in the middle, and I'm looking at all this, and it's so inverted and so backwards. And I just want to show people who, when they embrace the story of, say, the Holodomor, the Canadian government, literally, it's much more so than in the States. Up there, the Holodomor is as sacred as the Holocaust. It's one of those things you're not allowed to question in the schools and the universities. It's part of the curriculum that's taught. And the reason for that is the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. It's a group that's been around since 1940 in Canada. And over the years, they've become extremely powerful. After World War II, it was the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that was lobbying the Canadian government to bring over Waffen-SS guys like Yaroslav Hunka. They have a tremendous amount of power to this day, and they make damn sure that you don't criticize or question the Holodomor in Canada. And I just want to show you this because this is the Canadian government. These are the people that they're calling communists. What they're preaching right here is not communism, folks.
I am Alexandra Hitchie, National President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thank you for joining us as we commemorate the 89th anniversary and launch the 90th anniversary commemorative year of the Holodomor famine genocide of 1932-1933. Every year, our communities honor the millions of innocent victims of the Holodomor, Soviet Russia's attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people. This year, the need to unite has never been more critical. Russia has launched a full-scale war against Ukraine and is committing another genocide against the Ukrainian people. We must remain one with the people of Ukraine. This year, we unite under the motto Pamiętajmy, єднаємося, переможемо. We remember, we unite, and we shall overcome. We unite in memory of all the innocent people murdered by the Soviet communist regime during the Holodomor, and we unite in honor of the Holodomor survivors whose courage in sharing their story ensured that the world knew about the Holodomor. And we unite in recognition of the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people who today courageously defend their liberty and the freedom of Europe from Russia's tyranny.
Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. For starters, I'd like to thank the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress for bringing us together to reflect on and to preserve the memories of those we lost during the Holodomor. From 1932 to 1933, the Soviet regime orchestrated a deliberate famine. Millions of innocent victims suffered and lost their lives. This was a genocide against the Ukrainian people. And it was an attempt to erase their identity and to destroy their will. But the Ukrainian people endured. Every year during Holodomor Awareness Week and on Holodomor Memorial Day, we remember those we lost and the horrific atrocities that occurred, because remembering history is often our best hope against repeating it. On this solemn anniversary, as we remember the past, we also reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its people. We will never back down in our support, and we will never forget those we've lost. Vichna yim pamyat.
In the early 1930s, Joseph Stalin and his evil communist regime committed an unspeakable act of vile hatred, the Holodomor. In what was called the breadbasket of Europe, Soviet officials went door to door, stealing crops from starving Ukrainians and destroying their homes and watching millions of innocent people starve. As part of a broader attack on Ukrainian identity and culture, these officials committed acts of brutality that were deliberately covered up by the Soviet government. Today, on Holodomor Memorial Day, we remember the victims and honor the survivors of this genocide. All Canadians join with the people of Ukrainian heritage at home and around the world to mourn the tremendous loss inflicted on generations of Ukrainian people. Sadly, today, Ukrainians must continue to fight to defend their homeland and their people against familiar evil. The unprovoked attacks from Russia have once again caused needless loss of life and brought painful suffering to Ukraine. As we remember the victims of the Holodomor, we renew our commitment to the people of Ukraine. Canada will always stand with them as they fight to preserve their heritage, their democracy, and their freedom.
On behalf of all New Democrats, we remember the over 4 million Ukrainians who were killed and millions more that suffered under the Holodomor genocide. At the time, the international community did not hold those responsible to account. And now we are seeing history repeat itself with Putin's genocidal war against Ukraine. We, as members of the international community, have a responsibility to support the courageous bravery shown by the people of Ukraine. Their resilience is an inspiration, and it is our responsibility to back up that resilience and courage with international support so they can continue to defend themselves against the purposeless, completely senseless violence perpetrated by Putin against Ukraine. Ukrainians have shown incredible resilience, and it is a testament to the strength of their community. Again, on behalf of all New Democrats, we remember the Holodomor genocide, and we commit to protecting and supporting the Ukrainian people to prevent that from ever happening again and to ensure that Ukrainians can continue to thrive in peace and in freedom.
Shine.
Okay, so that is the official narrative in Canada. In Canada, they celebrate it as a national holiday. A whole week in November is Holodomor Remembrance Week or whatever they call it. It's the official orthodoxy that their government advances. As you can see, those are the leaders of the government. Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the opposition, the Conservatives. And while these two duke it out and they're supposed to be enemies, they're in perfect agreement. And when it comes, and even the leader of the new Democratic Party there, Jagmeet Singh, they all agree Russia bad, communism bad, Holodomor happened, and you must parrot this. Now, what confuses me, and I'm going to try and explain this because I'm sure it's going to confuse the hell out of you too, as an American. The convoy people who are adopting this Holodomor narrative, let's go get the communists, boys. Let's go beat them up. Let's go do something. Let's go do some violence to those evil commies. Here's the weird part. They are in perfect agreement with Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh. They're all in agreement. They're all parroting the same narrative. Now, mind you, these are the politicians that they hate. They blame them for the lockdowns, for the vaccine mandates, for the mask mandates, for all of that stuff, as well they should. Those are the politicians responsible for it. So why are they united on this one issue? That's what we're going to try and unpack tonight. I wanted to give you the official narrative, as uncomfortable as that might be for you as a communist, hearing that kind of talk. But you have to understand that in Canadian culture, questioning the Holodomor is considered hate speech and genocide denial. There are two narratives about this tragic famine. There's the Ukrainian nationalist version, which is Canada's official orthodoxy, and then there's the Russian version or the Soviet version. I know a lot of communists say that it was a hoax. Many respected historians and academics dispute the Ukrainian version of events. But professors at Canadian colleges and universities can literally lose their jobs if they teach any other narrative, however. Books like, for example, Douglas Toddle's book, which I'm sure you've read, his landmark study, Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, the Ukrainian Genocide Myth from Hitler to Harvard. That book is forbidden in Canadian classrooms, and I doubt you could find it in the public libraries up there. So, Caleb, I wanted to get your response to the Holodomor. Was it a myth? Who's telling the truth and who's not? Or at least in your perspective, what do you think?
Well, I want to first caution people about the language that they use. Some of the words that you used there, where you said myth, hoax, I make a point of not using words like that when I talk about this, because they really would like to equate what is alleged about Ukraine in the 1930s with the Holocaust. And to fit their narrative, they would then like to equate those of us who question it with people who deny the Holocaust. And so I am very, very careful to talk about this in a sensible way. Was there a famine in the 1930s, 1932, 1933 in the USSR, largely affected Ukraine? Absolutely there was. Were there a lot of innocent people who died? Absolutely. But you have to understand that in Ukraine, there were famines all the time before the Russian Revolution. Millions died regularly in the famines that happened, and that it was the Soviet Union that brought tractors to the Ukrainian countryside, that mechanized agriculture and created the modern agricultural system that electrified the Ukraine. I mean, it's like to blame the Soviet system for one famine that happened when it was the Soviet system that made that area modern, industrialized, wiped out illiteracy, caused the population to greatly expand due to access to healthcare, and that's just ridiculous. Now, in terms of other things, when this famine happened, what happened was that there was a natural crop shortage. And in light of that, the Soviet Union had to quickly reverse its policy. There was a group of peasants who owned their own land, rich peasants. Their nickname was the kulaks.
The kulaks.
Because they had employees and they would punch them, right? And they were known for being quite ruthless with their employees. They were called the kulaks. And the policy of the Soviet government in the 1920s, as they were rebuilding the country from the Russian Civil War, in which millions of people also died because the country was invaded by 15 different countries, their policy had been kulaks, enrich yourself, meaning that they promoted private agriculture. However, when this famine happened, there was a lot of hunger because there were food shortages. And these kulaks had a lot of extra food and they were refusing to share it. And so among the peasantry in Ukraine, you had many of the poorer peasants who were ganging up on the kulaks and lynching them and killing them and taking their crops. And Stalin saw this happening. And he said, okay, we can have a big, ugly bloodbath where the poor peasants all gang up on the rich peasants and steal their food. Or I can send the army in and we can create a collective agricultural system very formally. And that is what happened, right? Is that in order to prevent a bloodbath, in order to prevent the poor peasants from murdering the kulaks, Stalin sent the army in to do it in a formal way rather than a mob violence, chaotic way. And that in the context of a food shortage, they rapidly transitioned from a private farming system to a collective farming system. And it was bad. And I must add, though, that this didn't just happen in Ukraine. This happened in Moldova. This happened in Russia. This happened all over the Soviet Union.
And the United States, by the way, during the Dust Bowl. I'm an Oklahoma girl. I've heard all the stories about the Dust Bowl and how our people were dying of starvation, too, because, like you said earlier, we had no food stamps. There was no food relief. At that same time, we were going through a Great Depression. A lot of our people were dying of starvation, too.
Right. And that, at the time that this happened, there was criticism of the Soviet government. People said that they mismanaged, that because their economic policy had been promoting private farming and then they so rapidly switched, that caused a lot of chaos. That's all legitimate. You can argue that there were things that Stalin or the Soviet leadership did that made things worse. That's all fair game. And I'm open to any of that. But the narrative of Ukrainian nationalists is that this whole famine happened because Stalin just hated Ukrainians, because the Ukrainian people love freedom, and he just hated the Ukrainian people. So he plotted together with the Soviet officials to destroy the great Ukrainian nation. That's bullshit. The reason Ukraine has a written Ukrainian language is because of the Soviet Union. The borders of Ukraine were drawn and then expanded by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union electrified Ukraine. The Soviet Union wiped out illiteracy in Ukraine. I mean, the Soviet Union did a lot to promote the Ukrainian nationality, right? There were no borders on Ukraine before the Russian Revolution. There was just a part of the Russian Empire people called Ukraine, right? But it was Lenin and his position that every nationality should have its own written language, should have a seat in the Soviet House of Nationalities that existed in the original Soviet Constitution. It was really the concept of a Ukrainian nation was created by the Soviet Union. And they did a lot to promote Ukrainian art, to promote Ukrainian culture, to promote the Ukrainian language. And this whole narrative where the Soviet Union was trying to destroy the Ukrainian nationality is just bullshit. And I mean, if you read history, if you look at the Soviet policy, it's just bullshit. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, one of his big criticisms of the Soviet Union is he argues the Soviet Union did this kind of thing too much and that it divided them. They should have been focusing on what held the peoples of the Soviet Union together rather than promoting all these individual nationalities. So, it's one thing to say that some of the Soviet policies could have been done better, but it's another thing entirely to say that there was a plot to wipe out one particular nationality. That's just not the case. That's just not what happened. And there was malnutrition all over the USSR during these years, but it was the Soviet system that cured starvation in the Soviet Union by building a modern farming system, by bringing tractors to the countryside. I mean, you're blaming the system that cured starvation for starvation, something that happened before they came to power all the time. It's just not a logical interpretation of events. And it depends on an anti-communist bias. And it's just, it's unfortunate. And the way they want us to talk about it, they want us to use words like hoax or myth. And I'm not going to do that because there really was a famine and a lot of people did die. And, one thing I was taught when I went to university, they said, well, it had to have been a crime against humanity because they sold grain. They exported grain while the famine was going on. Is that true? Absolutely. And you know what they did with the grain? They used it to buy tractors. And I cannot imagine, we have no idea what the Soviet Union went through. You have to remember 15 countries invaded after the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War. They were barricaded, they couldn't get medicine, and there was mass death all over the USSR. Millions of people were dying. And the Soviet government sat there and they had to say, okay, now millions of our people are dying and there's going to be lots of death because of food shortages. Total, that's just going to happen. But if we take some of the grain and we sell it, we can then get tools so that we can have tractors and we can mechanize our agriculture and not have this happen again. Is it worth it? I can't imagine making those kind of decisions. Can you? We can't relate to that. You and I cannot relate to that kind of situation at all.
And there's something I want to add to that because I think it's an important factor to consider. When you talk about the Russian Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution, not only were they invaded by all these other countries, they were also being attacked from within. You had the Ukrainian nationalist movement there in Ukraine. You had the horrible pogroms, which was a genocide in 1919, 20, and 21, where Jews, Poles, and Soviets and communists were murdered, slaughtered en masse. And there may have been, I have heard some historians advance this theory, and I wanted to ask you about it, if there was some political aspect to the Holodomor, because we know that those areas where Holodomor happened, they were a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism, and that Stalin did apparently arrest and deport many of them because he was concerned that they were going to overthrow the Soviet Union. They were certainly planning on it.
Well, I think there were people who were engaging in armed violence against the state. I mean, it was clear that in the light of the food shortages that were caused by natural disaster, by natural droughts, etc., that there were food shortages, and the poor peasants were ganging up on the wealthy peasants, and it was like a war in the countryside, essentially. And the Red Army was sent in to make sure that things were done in an orderly fashion and it didn't become an episode of mob violence and killing. And
it didn't turn into those pogroms all over again that they'd seen before.
Yeah. And that, I mean, it was obviously an awful situation that neither you or I can ever relate to. Mass death on that level, starvation. But again, it drives me crazy because this fits in with this trope, right? There's two things about this I want to say. First thing, right, is that it fits in this trope, and I hear this over and over. Well, communism leads to people starving. No, communism cured people starving. It cured people starving in Russia. It cured people starving in China. It made both those countries industrial countries. And in parts of Africa, parts of South America that are still under capitalist domination, there's still starvation. So, it's like, how do they miss the forest for the trees? It's like the whole history of both Russia and China since the time the communists took power has been rising up and industrialized. And for them to just point, well, there was a famine here, so communism causes starvation. It's just like, it's infuriating. So there's that.
I can imagine.
The second thing is generally the numbers you get, these big numbers of deaths that you get from Holodomor or the Great Leap Forward in China or whatever. The way it's presented, especially by the libertarian or right-wing anti-communist crowd, is they say, well, communism killed a million people, right? And it's like, I mean, Lori, I think your dad was a prosecutor, right? And if someone's on trial for murder, and you accuse them of murder, you have to explain how they did it. You can't just say it happened, right? You have to have evidence. You have to have facts. You have to, well, no, it's just they killed this many million people. Well, no, they possibly had an economic policy that had problems that led to food shortages, something that happened before the revolution all the time, something they eventually got rid of. And, we all know what the Nazis did. The Nazis rounded up people on the basis of their race, put them on trains, took them to camps, and gassed them to death on the basis of their race.
But not just race. I have to bring this up every time we talk about, but the Nazis only killed Jews. Not true. the driving force that guided both the Ukrainian nationalists and the Nazis was anti-communism. And that's what a lot of people today do not understand. And they should understand it, because I believe, as a lot of historians believe, I don't know if you share this belief, that Nazism in its essence is anti-communism, and anti-communism is fascism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. And there's nothing that the Soviet government ever did that you can equate with what the Nazis did, right? People went to labor camps. That was awful. A lot of people who shouldn't have been there were in those labor camps, but most of them left after a year or two, and they lived, right? There were no gas chambers in the gulags, okay? Right. Furthermore, a famine that's caused by a failed agricultural policy. I'm pretty sure the Soviet officials didn't want there to be food shortages in the Soviet Union. They weren't intentionally doing it, but they were trying to raise their country up and industrialize. And under certain circumstances, there was a food shortage. That's not the same as the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust was intentional murder, okay? And bad economic policy or labor camp that people leave after 1 or 2 years. You cannot equate those things. You just can't do it. And that an attempt to equate those two things because you do some math is just not accurate. And it only passes because people have this anti-communist bias. People want to believe it. People are primed to believe it because that's what we're all told is communism is evil. Communism failed everywhere. And people believe it. And if you actually look into the facts of the situation, even if you accept the idea that the Soviet leaders, it was their mismanagement, it was their decisions that led to everything that went wrong, even if you accept that there was pure malicious intent on the part of Stalin and leadership, you still can't equate a crime of genocide with a crime of economic mismanagement. You can't do that, right? And and it frustrates me. And I mean, you sent me some articles, and I know about the Toggle book and other things, and I think those books all make a great point. I really recommend Blood Lies by Dr. Grover Furr. I really love that book. Yeah, because he shows that Timothy Snyder, who's the head of the Russian Studies Department at Yale, is a bullshit artist, and that a lot of his sources don't say what he claims they say. One of his books, he claims that so during the Red Army frequently raped Ukrainian women. And his source, which is in Russian, which is in the Russian archives, which no one's gonna go check because no one has access to it. Well, he went and checked it. The source was a Red Army soldier who did that being put on trial for doing it and given the death penalty. So how does that prove that this frequently happened? No, it's one time it happened and the guy got the death penalty for doing it. That's, not, and that there's a lot of bluffing like that. He says, well, according to the Soviet archives, Red Army soldiers frequently raped Ukrainian women. And then his source says something completely different. Right. And that, well, he's got an anti-communist bias. He's telling the American audience what they're primed to believe. He's telling the anti-communists what they want to hear. So no one bothers to fact check it. That's
one of those things that drives me nuts, Caleb. As a historian, I have come to see for myself that there's so much dishonest scholarship and in academia, especially during the Cold War. You had our university professors in the States, just as they do still in Canada today, teaching us a narrative that it often, when you really examine it and you hold it up under the light and you fact check it and check against other sources, it doesn't hold up. It falls apart. And when you look at Timothy Snyder's book and Robert Conquest's book about the Holodomor, a lot of this really started in the 80s. In fact, most of us had never heard of Holodomor until the 1980s. And that's when all these books started to come out and it kind of infected our culture. Can you talk a little bit about that and why we didn't really hear anything about Holodomor until all of a sudden in the 80s? And there's this explosion of books and what I consider to be dishonest academic scholarship on that subject.
I mean, it served a political purpose with the rise of neoconservatism, I think, with the ascendancy of figures like Ronald Reagan and such, where anti-communism became the basis of their argument. The idea that the USA is spreading freedom and these evil dictators are all around the world. And, I mean, it served, there were changes going on in U.S. politics at that time, with the defeat of Jimmy Carter and the rise of Ronald Reagan and the military-industrial complex, and with the Soviet Union starting to retreat, especially with the rise of Gorbachev. And, we were seeing the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, the liberalization and market reforms coming in that set the stage for the color revolutions across Eastern Europe, and that politics was shifting. And part of that was a change in the narrative and the conversation. And that, the communist world was very divided during those years. And China was moving in a more market direction. So there was a feeling that, yeah, and also it was a way of, you can't separate it from neoliberal economics, because neoliberal libertarian economics is predicated on the lie that communism's never worked anywhere, which is what I heard my whole life. Honestly, if I hadn't been told that, I probably wouldn't have become a communist. But it was just discovering that contradicted basic economic data, that all the statistics showed the Soviet Union had huge achievements in terms of industrialization and raising living standards, and China and Cuba and Libya under Gaddafi. It was seeing that, right? That forced me to look into the facts, and I realized how much we'd been lied to. But it was really, in order to, you can't really push the idea that you must privatize everything. You got to have prisons for profit. You got to have schools for profit. We can privatize the military with military contractors. The market is always better. The only way you can really push that logic is you have to get people to somehow believe that any alternative to the market, any attempt to have a socialist society has always made life worse, right? You really need that. And as they were pushing austerity and neoliberalism in the Western capitalist countries, the idea that socialism has never had any successes anywhere was a really big part of that. Margaret Thatcher, she said her whole thing about socialism, fails because eventually you run out of other people's money. And I hear that and I just want to slap myself in the face. I'm like, wait a second, did they run out of other people's money in the Soviet Union? Is China running out of other people's money? It's like, that's not what socialism is. Socialism isn't taxation, right? Socialism is not, taxation, but that is what neoliberal economists want us to believe, right? The post office and Stalin are both communism, and that's why we must privatize everything. That's the argument, right?
Yes,
If Medicare is just like what Stalin did, and we're all going to die, and that's how they pushed austerity, cutting public spending, cutting food stamps, cutting social assistance programs. It was by creating an atmosphere centered around anti-communism. And I really do think those changes that you're talking about in the 80s, where suddenly, there was all this talk, it was more about rolling back the welfare state in the West than anything that was going on in the developing world.
Interesting. I never looked at it that way. That does make a lot of sense, because that's what our government was in fact doing. And that's when we saw the death of Detroit, the death of our industrial base that had made us great. It was, the destruction of all those things that the Roosevelt coalition built in the 1930s, and the New Deal. And, as we discussed earlier in the show, if you have unemployment insurance, if you have Social Security, if you have Medicare, all of those things you can thank a little bit of socialism for. I'm just saying. It wouldn't have happened without their efforts, without their agitation, without their activism. President Roosevelt, who was by no means a communist, was actually convinced that these things would be good for the country, good for America. And I believe that the decades of prosperity that we saw after World War II, where, so much of the middle class was built on that Roosevelt model, which came from a little bit of communism. What do you say?
And let me add, what should have happened then? Right? If communism is responsible for all the problems the Soviet Union had, what should have happened then in the 90s? Then we should have seen a huge boom, right? Because then they had capitalism. They sold the state assets off to the highest bidder. The IMF and the World Bank went in there. The 90s should have been a paradise, according to this logic, because all of the problems the Soviet Union had were all caused by communism, and capitalism is always the answer. But what happened in the 90s? Shock therapy economics caused a mass epidemic of death and destruction. I mean, and read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, read Europe Since 1989 by Philip Thayer, read the history of neoliberalism, and look at what the implementation of radical free market policies in Russia in the 90s resulted in. And what it resulted in Bolivia, what it resulted in Chile, what it resulted in country after country in South America during the 80s and 90s as well. Neoliberal free market economics tends to create mass starvation, death, and poverty. And that is something that this conversation about the evils of communism kind of distracts from. I went to Ecuador when I was 12 years old in 1999 in the middle of a man-made famine. And I saw all kinds of desperately poor, starving people. And all that poverty and starvation was caused by the fact that Ecuador had been forced by the IMF to abandon its currency and adopt the US dollar as its currency and sell its oil industry that had been nationalized and sell it off to American oil companies. And then on top of that, the Asian markets collapsed. And that was engineered by the United States. There was the collapse of the Asian markets where the USA pulled all its money out of Singapore and all these places. And that, combined with what they called at the time El Nino, which was some weather patterns, people think it now may have had something to do with global warming. You saw hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Ecuador or dying or starving. And I was in Ecuador. I landed in Quito, Ecuador at the airport, and the streets were all full of these desperately poor, starving people from the countryside who were there in the cities trying to get some food. Why don't we talk about that? Russia's population decreased by 10% between 1996 and 2006. 10%. 1 in 10 people either died or left the country. The suicide rate skyrocketed. The drug addiction rate skyrocketed. If you went to any of the subways, you'd see a bunch of elderly people who had no pension and no social security trying to sell you their clothes so they could have some food to eat with, trying to sell you yesterday's newspaper so they could have some food to eat with. Neoliberal economics has a huge body count. And no one wants to talk about that because we're told, well, it's communism that has the body count. But we shouldn't be surprised because neoliberal economics had a body count when the British imposed it on India in the 1800s. It had a body count in many African countries. It had a body count in China. The Opium Wars, 2 Opium Wars were waged to force free trade and free market economics onto China. And it resulted in at least 100 million deaths, according to the statistics the Chinese Communist Party has assembled, because it prevented China from developing its own industries. It kept the country divided. It kept, and 1928, Edgar Snow visited China and millions of people were starving to death in a famine. And the reason this famine was happening is because the fields that should have been growing food were growing opium poppies for the British drug trade. And because they had no strong central government, there was food in other parts of the country and there was starvation in other parts. And the government was not well organized enough to take the food, surplus from one area to another area. There wasn't a strong central government. These regional warlords were doing one thing and the central government was doing another thing, and there was chaos. And so they couldn't mobilize famine relief. They even had enough food, but people were still starving. Free trade, free market capitalist economics has led to millions of deaths, but those deaths don't count for some reason, right? Mm-hmm. Those deaths are never calculated. That's just something we don't think about. But if anyone dies in a communist country for any reason, if there's ever a food shortage, if there's ever a problem, that's purely murder by communists. That's
propaganda win for the West, and they're going to use it in any way that they possibly can. Yeah. Which brings us back to what's going on in Canada this week, and something I wanted to sort of to put a punctuation mark on that, because I know we're running out of time, but
yes,
it's crazy to me, as much as they love to demonize Russia and they say that the people don't have any freedom over there. I just want to say that we have a large Canadian audience at Maverick News. The channel is based in Ontario, Canada. Most of our viewers, I'd say about 70%, are Canadian, but tonight's show is not being seen by our Canadian viewers. Unfortunately, we decided that it would not be a good idea to stream this out to the Canadian channels in our Maverick News network, which is a global network, because of the sensitive topic of the Holodomor, which thou shalt not question in Canada. We don't want to be accused of hate speech or genocide denial, which is actually a thing in Canada. So it's a suppression of free speech and free thought in Canada. Yet this show is going out tonight to our Russian channels in our network. So
Great.
they have more free speech in Russia, apparently, than they do in Canada. And to wrap this conversation up, and I appreciate you going overtime with me because it's just so good. I didn't want to cut you off. It's just such an important conversation to have. But I wanted to ask you, now the big debate in Canada after Nazigate is, what do we do about it? I mean, they're finally admitting that Canada has a Nazi problem, and it's a big Nazi problem, and it's been there a long time. Only now are they facing it, admitting it, and most of all, they're going to have to take some action to do something about it. Now, there's calls for the resignation of Justin Trudeau. There's calls for the resignation of Chrystia Freeland. There are even calls for every single member of the Canadian Parliament, all 338 of them who were on their feet, clapping like trained seals last week, to resign or to dissolve the government completely and call elections. What do you think that Canada should do about it?
Well, I think now is a great time to have a conversation about how the United States basically forced this on Canada. The United States, led Canada into the position on Ukraine that it takes, and that maybe Canada should be more concerned about its own sovereignty and its own national interest than, a crusade against Russia on the other side of the world.
That's a great answer. And, Rick and I were talking about that, I think, last week, where he was talking about how Canada's always been so subservient to the United States because, the way he puts it, we're right next door to a superpower. We don't have much of a military. What choice do we have? We kind of have to accommodate whatever the United States wants. And I said to him, yeah, sort of like Austria did when they were next door to Nazi Germany. What choice did they have?
Yeah, indeed.
It's not so unlike that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
One last thing before you go, if you could
Okay.
spare me 5 more minutes. When we're talking about solutions, believe it or not, well, you know this, but there are many in Canada and the United States on both the left and the right who say that the answer, the way to fix it, is we have to invade Canada and liberate them from their Nazi government. And so, we've got people like Tucker Carlson, who I have a great deal of respect for, but even Tucker's on board with this. He said we need a Bay of Pigs style invasion of Canada. There's Lieutenant Steve Rogers on the right, who's started this SOS letter writing campaign from Canadians to the United States Congress saying, please help us, come liberate us. Our country is being held hostage. And even on the left, you've got a guy who claims to be a communist, Jackson Hinkle, a MAGA communist, if you will. He is also endorsing this idea. And I just want to play you a quick clip of why a so-called communist thinks it's a good idea for the United States military to invade Canada.
With
Here we go.
Miss Russia, right?
I'm dating Miss Universe Russia. Beautiful woman.
How did that happen?
I slid in her DMs.
They said Putin hooked you up with her.
I wish that was the case. I
No,
love
it wasn't.
Putin. But I've never met Putin. I'd love to meet Putin. I sent him a letter at the start of the war. I don't know if he got it.
You met Ye though, right?
I FaceTimed him.
Oh, you FaceTimed
Wow.
him.
How did that happen?
He was running for president. A lot of people know that. And his campaign didn't go very far. I think he kind of nipped that in the bud. But some friends of mine were leading his campaign and involved with the campaign. And something I'm really passionate about, like our founding fathers in the United States believe that, you guys know what manifest destiny is, like westward expansion. All that stuff.
I haven't heard it. I haven't heard it before.
When we had like the colonies in the United States, or it wasn't the United States, we had British colonies. The Brits didn't want us to expand past like Eastern mountains into Western America and develop Western America and tap into all those vital resources, because they were fearful that those colonies would break off and form a country, a nation state. But the founding fathers all wanted to not only extend all the way to California, they wanted to take it all the way to Mexico, invade Canada and liberate Canada and bring that into the United States. And I think that we should do it. I think that we should invade Canada. Why are we spending this money on Ukraine when we could literally have Canada? You know, we've spent $200 billion on Ukraine. For what? For what? Most of it's being siphoned off into like black markets and offshore accounts, and Zelensky's buying these mansions in Italy and Miami, Lake Como, wherever. What if we just took Canada? It's a nice country. They have a lot of oil, and it would just basically achieve the American dream.
So you want to send troops to Canada and totally take over?
Yeah, I think
do you think we have to fight Canada, or they probably just be like, here, you guys can have it?
Well, but long story short, that's what I was discussing with Kanye, because he liked the idea. He liked the idea of invading.
I never even thought about invading Canada, because we more so like cater to them, but they're like, you know, our friend. We don't really mess with them.
Well, there's like two factors to it, because right now there's that Trudeau government in Canada.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's so sad to see what's happening there. You know, censorship is bad in America, but in Canada,
it's terrible.
If you say the wrong thing, you could literally be fined or imprisoned.
Wow.
And I'm not making that up. It's very real. And in addition to that, you also have the age-old fight between Britain and the U.S. Britain financed Canada in the War of 1812 when they burned down the White House. So Canada has been used as a proxy by the British Empire against the U.S. for years. And it seems like we're friends with the Brits right now, but a lot of top American political elites are not. Like Trump hates Britain in the city of London. So I think that it would be, just to avoid any further wars in the future, we should just go in and take it.
Oh, my head hurts. Can you make any sense of that?
Well, clearly this is the greatest Marxist of all time. I mean, this is like hearing Karl Marx himself or Vladimir Lenin. I mean, this is probably what Che Guevara would say on the situation. You know, if Mao or Stalin or Gus Hall or William Z. Foster were here, I mean, they would sound exactly like that. We know that. These are the most well thought out, articulate thoughts, you know, are putting forward a genuine communist analysis. I'm sure that Jackson came to that conclusion after a lengthy study of dialectical materialism and Marxism. So, you know, I mean, he probably knows way more about this than I do. So I just want to defer to Jackson Hinkle. You know, I mean, if you can argue with him, I mean, it's like, you know, this is clearly a sophisticated, well thought out position that he has. So, you know, why argue with him?
I think not. I mean, you know, it's astonishing to me, really, that any nation, anywhere, especially after the last 20 some odd years that we've invaded country after country and just demolished everything in our path and ruined Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and on and on and on. Why would any country in the world actually beg the United States to come liberate them? Guys, I don't think it's going to work out the way you think it's going to work out. I'm just saying, I don't think it's the answer.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't want to speculate too much about why he might be saying that, but, you know, generally my understanding of the role of communists in America is that we don't advocate the American imperialist government invading more countries. That's
what I thought.
You know, that doesn't mean we endorse the Canadian government, and I share your outrage about what they are and what they're done. You know, but you know, I really, you know, I again, it makes me wonder, because there are, as you said, there are certain American forces that are talking about this and such, and there are certain forces in Canada that are calling for this, and it seems like we have a certain social media personality who's calling for this. You know, and I think I would assume that him saying that has a lot more to do with those forces and his relationship with them than it has to do with communism.
I think you're exactly right, my friend. Exactly right. And I know we can't dig into that further because we're way over time, but thank you so much for the extra time tonight. What an amazing conversation with you, as it always is. Thank you. Before we go, just tell folks where people can get your new book and where they can find you and follow you and support you.
I'm on YouTube. I'm with the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. And the new book is Letter to Bob Avakian, available wherever books are sold. You know, check it out. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It is always a pleasure, Caleb. We'll see you back here again soon. And we'll see you guys back here next Saturday night, 9 p.m. Eastern for Strange Bedfellows. Good night, everyone. Peace.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.